Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'll give you a couple more seconds to find your seats. Happy Thursday evening. My name is Lindsay Simpson. I serve on City Council as Mayor Pro Tem for the City of Hendersonville, and I'm really excited about this evening's agenda, and I'm really excited that all of you chose to spend your evening with us. A couple of housekeeping things, and then we will dive in. Through a partnership with True Ridge, we have interpretation services available. So if any of our attendees would like to listen to the program in Spanish, please visit the table up here on the left side of the stage.
Buenas tardes, mi nombre es Melissa Escobar de True Ridge. Si alguien necesita servicios de interpretación, por favor pase por la mesa, le podemos dar el equipo para que escuche esta presentación en español. Gracias.
Thank you so much to True Ridge for doing that for us. Also, this evening's agenda and a way that you can sign up to receive ongoing updates for the city's strategic housing plan development are available at all the entrances and via QR codes that are posted around the building. And lastly, this evening's summit will begin with a presentation by our keynote speaker, followed by a short break and a panelist discussion. Following the event, we encourage everyone to visit the resource room that's behind the stage just across the hall here, where many of our nonprofits have information and materials available. All right, let's dive in. So a little bit of background on kind of how we got to this evening. Several months ago, the city received a grant from Dogwood Health Trust to do a strategic housing plan. And myself and several of our staff members went to a strategic housing conference in Raleigh last October, where we actually had the honor of hearing Shane Phillips, who's our keynote speaker, speak. We learned a little bit more about his book. We ended up getting our hands onto it, and we decided that it would really be best for us to form a strategic housing committee to help lead the plan, and we formed that back in February. Well, the committee had their first meeting in March, and can you believe that we've pulled this event together in just a couple of months? So I do want to give a round of applause for all of our staff and our committee that were able to pull this off so quickly. Because I think most of us are aware that nothing happens that fast in government. Okay, so let's get into the meat and potatoes of the event. Shane Phillips is a researcher, public speaker, and consultant on housing policy and affordability. He manages the housing initiative within the UCLA Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies, focusing on research, policy analysis, and education. And he co-hosts the UCLA Housing Voice podcast, a bi-weekly interview show that translates emerging research for a non-academic audience. He's the author of The Affordable City, published in 2020, which advocates for a three-pronged approach to solving the housing crisis and offers more than 50 recommendations for advancing those priorities. Outside of his role at UCLA, Shane has presented to audiences across the U.S. and abroad and worked with local governments and organizations to identify context-specific solutions to their housing challenges. Originally hailing from Seattle, he earned his bachelor's degree in biochemistry from the University of Washington and master's degrees in public administration and urban planning from USC. Please join me in welcoming Shane Phillips to Hendersonville.
Thank you. I don't think I need two microphones. Is this microphone working? Sounds like it. Perfect. Well, I am very excited to be here. I feel very complimented to be invited back so quickly. And this is an interesting experience just because this is a very different community than the ones I've worked with in the past. Just the size, the range from pretty urban to pretty rural. I'm really excited to meet more of the folks here today and really appreciate the invitation. This is, I promise you, as much a learning experience for me as I hope it is for many of you. For just a little bit more background about me, hello, I'm Shane Phillips. I grew up in Washington State, mostly in the suburbs, within an hour or two of Seattle. I've got a pretty unusual background for being here today. I was the first among my whole wide extended family to go to college, though before that, I dropped out of high school. I worked as a cable installer at Comcast and a package loader and sorter at UPS. And then I went back to school and got a degree in biochemistry for some reason. I took the entrance exams for medical school and did quite well, but while working as a tuberculosis researcher at the University of Washington, I realized that what I'd really become passionate about was not medicine, but urban planning. yada, 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 15 years later, I am here before you talking about housing affordability. So nowadays, I am a researcher at the UCLA Randall Lewis Housing Initiative, and there we study the effects of different policies on affordability, displacement, access to opportunity, you name it. I am a researcher at heart, and I can and do often spend hours absorbed by a giant data set. But what I am really passionate about is turning the knowledge generated at schools like UCLA into real-world policy, and more importantly, into real-world improvements in people's lives. So that is what brings me here. I may get more wonky and technical than is appropriate a few times here, so please just know that I am here because I want your community to succeed, to be a place that adapts to an evolving future, yes, but also a place that you can continue to be proud of, excited of, and call home. You are going to be asked to make a lot of decisions about the future of your community in the months and years to come, and every decision will come with trade-offs. You will have to let your own values guide you and be aware that keeping the same policies in place will not preserve things as they are. It will just keep you on your current trajectory. I would encourage you to ask and discuss with your neighbors some very basic questions. And this is not all of them. This is just some examples. So, do we prioritize the value of our homes or the ability of our children and friends to continue living here comfortably? Where will we live when we get older? Will we be able to downsize or to get around independently if or when, really when, we develop a disability at some point in our lives? Will we be affordable enough and offer the right amenities to attract young families? Where will our teachers, nursing assistants, and grocery store workers live? What happens to our stores and healthcare facilities and schools if they can't afford to live here? What resources do we want to see in our community that we don't already have? And what would we need to do, what would we need to change to bring them here and keep them here? However deep in the weeds on policy we get here tonight, those are the kinds of questions that these discussions are all about. And they're the questions I really cannot answer for you. Along with many others who work for and within and outside of Hendersonville, my role is really just to help you think about your options and present you what I know about the likely consequences of one path or another. Did just want to give one more pitch for the podcast. I learn more doing this podcast than anything else I do. A lot of the things I'm going to talk about today are discussed in much greater length in the podcast. So if you are interested, feel free to check it out. We've got 70-something episodes, over 70 hours worth of content. So if you're really jonesing for some housing policy discussions, this is the place to go. A few years ago, I wrote a book called The Affordable City, which is sort of a handbook for the policies that can help cities stay affordable. Oops. I don't want to get ahead of myself. While researching and writing about these dozens of policies, I started thinking about what connected them. And I came up with the themes of supply, stability, and subsidy, and those are going to be, those three S's are going to be the focus of my talk as well. I will get to those later, but before we get too far, and the folks who are in Raleigh will have heard this before, I imagine at least some of you are wondering why you have someone from California, and not just California, but Los Angeles, of all places, here to talk about housing affordability. No one here will be surprised to hear or learn that whatever housing challenges you have here in Hendersonville and Western North Carolina, things are much worse in LA. So it is reasonable to wonder what someone from LA could have to teach you. And my short answer is that as someone who has experienced LA up close for 10 years, I am here to tell you not to be like us. At least do not act the way we've acted for the past 40 or so years. Learn from our mistakes and do everything you can not to repeat them. Don't do that. Don't do that. I do have a longer, more substantive answer, and it's that even though LA's problems may seem very distant, they are a lot closer than you think. On the one hand, yes, the median home value in Los Angeles is over $900,000, down from almost $1 million just last year. At current interest rates, you have to earn more than $200,000 a year to afford the median home. Home prices in LA are more than double yours here, and in that sense, we are still very different places. On the other hand, when I study and visit cities and towns across the country, I see almost everyone doing what got Los Angeles and the whole state of California where they are today. I see plans and zoning codes written in the 50s and 60s and 70s that have barely been updated to reflect the lessons from the past 50 plus years or the way that society and technology has changed. I see communities betting their futures and the futures of their children on the hope that if they don't plan for more residents, then they just won't show up. I see indecision and delay and inaction as the fruits of a growing economy are captured by our homes rather than ourselves and our neighbors. In Los Angeles, we got what we planned for, or did not plan for, really. Homes that cost at least double what the typical middle-class family in Los Angeles can afford, and 50,000 homeless people on any given night, more than 1 out of every 100 residents in the city. We have the most overcrowded housing market in the nation, and among the longest and certainly most unpleasant commutes. We struggle to hold on to businesses whose customer base isn't in Los Angeles, and a huge share of our budget now goes towards solving housing problems that we created for ourselves, over $1 billion a year in a city with a budget of $12 billion. This was all done in the name of protecting the unique neighborhood character of Los Angeles, the things that made it special, and that current residents most appreciated about living there. The ironic truth is that we could not have destroyed things more effectively if we'd done so intentionally. We made the mistake of believing that we could build a great place and then freeze it in time, and that no one else would ever want to be a part of the wonderful thing that we had built. Or maybe we believed that the built environment was more important to the neighborhood character than the neighbors themselves. Either way, we were very wrong. I guess I wasn't around when all these decisions were made, so I'm not taking credit. What I want to emphasize is that from a housing policy perspective, California is not so different from Hendersonville or Asheville or most of your neighbors or most of the US. What really distinguishes us from you, and again, only from a housing perspective, because I understand that being compared to Los Angeles might be considered a grievous insult by some here. What really distinguishes us from you is that the demand for housing hit LA much earlier and much harder. But we are on a similar trajectory, and you're really just a few decades behind. So that's the bad news. But it's also, in a way, good news. It means that you can change course before you end up with LA-sized problems. The longer you wait, the worse things will get, and the harder it will be to solve the problems that crop up. But the sooner you act, the more options you will have. I wanted to just cover some basic stats, because I think these are the kinds of things that a lot of people don't really know about their own community. They know their neighbors, they know maybe what's in their immediate vicinity, but they don't really know what their city looks like, big picture. So population 1,500, which is up 15% from 10 years ago. These are data averaged over 5 years, and so it's 2018 to 2022 in the case of the 2020 data, just want to be clear about this. Housing units are up 20% since 2012. Half of your homes are a single family home, either attached or detached. Another 20% or so are 2 to 4 units, and almost 30% are in 5 or more unit buildings. The median home value back then in 2020 was around 253. Zillow's estimate right now is about 410. It has increased very, very dramatically in a very short time, as it has across the country, to be clear. Median rent is up 22%. This isn't adjusted for inflation. This is adjusted for inflation. Your vacancy rate is way down. And I think that's important because you had a lot of vacant housing 10 years ago that was able to pick up a lot of slack as your community grew. You don't have as much slack anymore. And if you're going to accommodate people, it means you're going to have to build. A few more here. More than half of the households in the city are renters. The median income is $50,000, but there's a sharp divide between renters and homeowners, as there is almost everywhere. Renters earn $37,000, $38,000 at the median level. Homeowners is almost $65,000. Average household size is under 2, down from 2.3 10 years ago. Almost half of your households are just one person. And 22% of your housing is either studios or one bedrooms, and 44% is 2 bedrooms. So I just think that's maybe helpful context a little bit. So with that said, my book includes over 50 policy recommendations, but my focus in presentations like this is always on big picture priorities. I do this because policies, frankly, are pretty easy to come by, and in scholarly and professional circles, there's pretty broad agreement about the kinds of policies that can improve affordability. The challenge is really not in coming up with a list of effective policies, it's implementing them in a world where every change comes with trade-offs, with winners and losers, and where changing course is always harder than maintaining the status quo, even when we know the status quo has many problems. So my framework for thinking about these 3 S's is what I call the 3 S's: supply, stability, and subsidy. And I'm going to briefly summarize what they are, zoom out a bit, and share more about how they relate to each other. And I'll spend a bit more time on supply near the end here, because it's really the thing that you have the greatest control over at the local level. I'll also share some of the, to me, inspiring and promising solutions I've seen across the US in big cities and small towns, and in conservative and liberal jurisdictions, and at the state level as well as the local. So then, again, a quick summary of the 3 S's. First is supply, and this goal is really about making sure we have enough housing to meet current and future needs, not just to accommodate population growth, but also demographic shifts like an aging population and shrinking household sizes, as you saw on the screen a few slides ago, long-term economic shifts like remote and hybrid work, goals to preserve open space or agricultural land, mobility and economic development goals, and so on. It's about making sure we have, really the reason that supply is so critical is because the mismatch between housing supply and housing demand is the root cause of high and rising prices in most US cities. And as I said, I will come back to some more detail on this. Fundamentally, prioritizing housing supply is about acknowledging that we live in a world of both physical and economic constraints. There's the physical constraint that a growing and aging and changing population requires a growing and changing stock of homes. We simply need the space. There's no getting around that. The United States does have a serious inequality problem compared to many other developed countries, and that inequality does extend to housing as well, but you can't redistribute your way out of a shortage. To reduce scarcity, you do have to build things. Then there's the economic reality that when housing is scarce, homeowners and landlords gain market power, and that power comes at the expense of home buyers and renters, and of future generations generally. We have decades of evidence showing that when cities build more housing, they're better able to keep rents and prices in check. That's true whether the new homes are market rate or subsidized, though both help and both have different strengths and weaknesses, and really weaknesses is not the word, but different strengths and benefits. And we see that effect from the metro area all the way down to the block level. I'm not going to dwell too much on the research here, but if anyone's interested, I've done some summaries of this. There are some others out there that are really great. Housing abundance is not just about the number of homes, but how suitable they are to a community's diverse range of needs. From single adults to large families, from birth to early career to retirement. Policies that support supply include things like zoning, reforms to zoning and building codes. I'm going to skip through these pretty quick. Review and approval processes, and development standards like parking and setbacks, all of which just determine what can be built. So supply policies can also help preserve or restore your existing stock of housing, making sure that we get the most out of the housing we already have. So next is stability. Stability is about making sure that as much as possible, when change comes to a community, it doesn't come at the expense of those with the least to lose. It's not about freezing things in amber or shielding people from all consequences, but providing some measure of security and predictability for for everyone who does their part and contributes. But maybe more philosophically, if supply is about acknowledging economic and physical constraints in the housing market, then stability, for me, is about acknowledging the moral obligations that we have to our fellow citizens and neighbors. There are reasons to be concerned. I always get questions about this, about the impact of policies like eviction protections and displacement protections, short-term rental regulations, and things of that nature. The fact is that tenant protections and preservation programs and other stabilizing policies can have negative effects, especially if designed poorly, or if they're adopted without complementary strategies to encourage supply. There are also valid concerns about how we implement supply and subsidy policies. The details really always matter. But envisioning our future, and again, I can't speak for Hendersonville, but at least for me, I hope most of us can agree that the future should be one where a tenant's rent can't be hiked 30% in 1 year, where they can't be evicted for no reason, as is often allowed, and where they're ultimately not treated as full citizens. They're second-class citizens. They don't have the same rights at some level. In the past, I think the attitude toward housing stability was that if you wanted security and predictability, buy a home. There are a lot of reasons that that idea was flawed, but it was at least more defensible 50 years ago, 30 years ago, when you could buy a home for 1 or 2 times the typical annual salary of the usually single breadwinner in the family. Now there are very few places in the country where you can buy a home for less than 4 or 5 times the median income for an entire household. And in many cities, the ratio is 6, 7, 8 to 1 or more. In Los Angeles, it varies between 10 and 12 to 1. To be clear, stabilizing policies do not need to be so strong that they sacrifice all of a landlord's rights and privileges, for example, in favor of tenants. All we need, in my view, is a better balance, and the right balance will be different in Los Angeles than it is in Hendersonville or Asheville or Atlanta or Indianapolis. I would not want to be a tenant in most cities, and one major reason why is the difficulty of planning out your future when your housing situation is so fundamentally insecure. I imagine most of you feel the same, and I think it's important for all of us to ask whether it's okay to subject others to something that we wouldn't want to endure ourselves, especially when we know that the tenants have no realistic alternative in most cases. Stabilizing policies can include things like rent stabilization, eviction protections, rules ensuring people who receive housing assistance are actually able to use it, and find landlords who will accept it. Moving on to the third S, subsidies. Well-designed markets can serve most people more efficiently and effectively than government in many parts of the economy. And I believe very strongly that that applies to housing as well. Markets have incredible power and potential, but markets also inevitably leave some people behind because some people are too poor to rent to or sell to profitably, because of informational asymmetries, because of all the reasons that Econ 101 textbooks tell us that market failures can occur. And even though stability policies are important, they're really just about protecting people from worsening circumstances like rising rents or eviction. They don't have much power to proactively improve people's lives. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes, you just have to spend some money to make that happen. The reality is that we spend a lot of public money, mostly federal, on housing policies. It's just that somewhere around 80% of it goes to homeowners, and most of that goes to the wealthiest homeowners, the ones earning $150,000 or $200,000 or more per year on things like tax exemptions. We will not go down that road, but I just wanted to flag that. Without spending public resources on housing, and specifically housing assistance for people who don't make $200,000 or more per year, many will be left behind as economies and communities change. Without subsidies, people who could have quickly gotten back on their feet with a little support can instead end up falling into worse circumstances and requiring much more intensive, long-term, and costly assistance down the road. We see this with homelessness all the time, especially in a place like Los Angeles. We see that we can actually reduce the long-term costs to the public by providing assistance early. and that it's often more costly to leave a person living on the street using emergency health services and interacting with law enforcement more frequently than to simply provide the financial assistance needed to help them afford housing. Subsidies are often used for supporting the construction of housing affordable to middle and lower income families, on long-term rent assistance programs like housing vouchers, and for shorter-term assistance like transitional housing, and they're really necessary for the operation of homeless shelters as well. Funding for many of these programs mostly comes from the federal government, but locally, development of affordable housing options can be supported by things like property tax abatement or fee reductions, which have short-term costs for sure, but can pay dividends in the long run, often very significantly. Taking a step back here, the underlying message of the 3 S's is that different people and different communities have different needs. A new market rate apartment building helps keep rents from rising as quickly across the housing market, but it does not do anything for someone who's facing an imminent eviction. Supportive housing is a critical part of the solution to homelessness, but it doesn't do anything to keep homeownership within reach of a middle-class family. No community can address all of its housing needs by pouring 100% of its efforts into supply alone or stability alone or subsidy alone. To me, the changes that we saw during and in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic are probably the best possible example of why supply is not a complete substitute for stability and subsidy. It showed us how demand can really hit the stratosphere with a snap of the finger, with many people's rents going up 20 or 30% in a year. Supply helps stabilize rents and house prices, and I will get more into how that works, but it takes years to plan and build housing, and we don't always have that much time. Without policies like rent stabilization, for example, which can be designed to balance landlord and tenant interests, we have no credible response, I don't think, for the family whose rent increased from $1,200 to $1,600 year to year, who can't move elsewhere without losing access to gainful employment and a family network that saves them thousands and thousands of dollars on childcare, and can't buy a home anytime soon when the average home costs 6 times their income or more, as it does in Hendersonville, to be clear, up from 4 times just a few years ago. But as useful as stabilizing policies can be for giving people like the one I just described breathing room and helping them navigate through crises, they mostly don't address the underlying causes of housing affordability and instability. Cities like San Francisco and New York, and yes, Los Angeles, are poster children for what happens when you try to use stability policies as a substitute for adequate supply of housing rather than as a complement to it. We also need parallel strategies within each of these 3 S's. More housing is better than less, all else equal, but if all you allow is large single-family homes on large lots, then you're gonna fail to meet the needs of a lot of households, including people who live in single-family homes in your community right now, but would like to downsize without leaving them to another city or region. Beyond the effects of these different policy priorities, I think this all matters from a coalition building perspective as well. Every community is gonna have different groups and interests represented. Just thinking at the household level, we might imagine that a recent college graduate looking for their first apartment on their own has somewhat different needs and wants than an 80-year-old widower, to say nothing of a 5-person family with 2 parents, a 3-person family with 1 parent, a family in their late 20s versus one in their late 50s, a household with 3 unrelated roommates, or someone with a fully remote job versus one that requires them to be on site every day. We also have non-household interests, like businesses that want to keep their costs down, landlords who want to get a fair return on their investment, public administrators who want to make sure the city's budget is healthy and they can continue providing services. With all of these interests out there, none of us can get anything done really without making common cause with others. And that starts with understanding other people's priorities and values. Evaluating our future plans through the lenses of supply, stability, and subsidy is one way, surely not the only way, but one way of making sure that we're considering many of these different interests. And it can push us to identify solutions that take those different interests into account so we can all go forward together. Beyond the arguments for each of these 3 S's individually, I want to emphasize the relationships between them and how they reinforce each other's shortcomings. I've learned in the past few years that when people read or hear about supply, stability, subsidy, the affordable city, they can be tempted to take a somewhat partial approach. They will like the argument in favor of supply policies like upzoning, but not stabilizing policies like rent stabilization or eviction protections, or vice versa. Or they'll like the idea of more subsidies for affordable housing, but hate the idea of any kind of reforms that allow for more market rate production, or again, vice versa. So they'll pick one or two priorities and discard the rest. I would prefer that you think of supply, stability, and subsidy as a three-legged stool for affordable communities. Sturdy and resilient when all the legs are in place, but if you remove any one, it will topple right over. Supply without stability can lead to haphazard development, among other things. It adds housing, yes, but it does so without regard for the locations or kinds of development that are most likely to have negative consequences, like direct displacement of existing residents. Supply without any accompanying subsidies leaves many struggling households with too little income to afford even the lowest quality housing on the market, and they're left behind. Stability without supply or without subsidy is ultimately managed decline. It is not progress. This path is, again, this is kind of LA's path. It's trying to stand athwart history and yell stop, and it is exactly as effective as you would imagine. Stability policies can treat and delay and mitigate the symptoms of a dysfunctional housing market, and that is important and necessary, but they rarely address the underlying causes on their own. And finally, subsidy without supply is a recipe for endlessly increasing costs. Again, great example in Los Angeles. 6 years after spending a few $1 billion on housing and services for homeless residents, we now have more homelessness, and the cost of building a 400 square foot supportive housing unit has gone from $350,000 a unit, which was already very high, to over $600,000 per unit. We would be in an even worse place without spending that money, but trying to solve our problems by spending money alone, it does not work. And finally, subsidy without stability can result in many people needing assistance who might not have needed it otherwise. When people lack housing security, they're much more likely to rely on housing assistance, either long-term or short-term. These just work better together than apart. What time is it? Can I get a time check? And how much time do I have? I did not ask that ahead of time, so I'm just kind of winging it here. 6:30. Okay, I'm going to skip a few slides. You don't get to learn from President Ike. So, as I mentioned earlier, supply is really the thing that you have the most control over locally. Land use policy has historically been handled by local jurisdictions, for better and for worse, so I want to spend a bit more time on it. First, I just want to get us on the same page about what the supply picture has looked like in the US over the last half century or so. This image shows per capita housing production in major metro areas across the country for two time periods, 1990 to 2007 in orange and 2008 to 2018 in green. And what it shows is that in every one of these metro areas, they built less housing per capita in the latter period than in the previous. Cities with some of the highest demand, like LA and New York City, built barely any housing during either period, which is part of why so many Californians are moving to North Carolina today. Zooming out even further, this chart shows per capita housing production since about 1960. Even with the regular ups and downs that follow the economic cycle, you can see a very, very clear downward trend. Housing is getting more scarce, and the result is that despite getting older, and in many cases lower quality, it is also becoming much less affordable. As a researcher, I genuinely do my best to accommodate different interpretations of research. It is complicated, and how you design a study really can skew the results that you come away with. But within the world of housing research, there is almost nothing I can say with more confidence than that if you have two cities with similar demand or the same demand, the one that builds more housing will end up more affordable over the medium and long term. There's a very common There's a very common belief that building homes attracts rich people, and those rich people moving here is what drives up the price of nearby housing. I hear that all the time, and frankly, I absolutely understand why people jump to that conclusion. But there is very little evidence that it's true, and there is a whole lot of evidence to the contrary. The reality is that all over the country, most of the people who move into new housing are from the same metro area where that housing was built. But even if that weren't the case, it wouldn't be a reason not to build homes, because rich people can afford to move to your city whether you build new homes or not. I grew up in Washington State, and if you've moved from one part of the country to another, I think you might understand this more intuitively. If you've been on Zillow or apartments.com, you can look for units in specific cities or counties, and you can choose the age range of the housing that you're interested in. You can look at single family only, multifamily, whatever you like. I'm gonna go out on a limb and say that no one who's looking for housing goes on these sites without any geographic preference and searches only for new multifamily housing. Like, I don't care whether it's Portland or St. Louis or Hendersonville or Buffalo, just as long as it was built in the last 3 years. No one does that. What most of us do, and what I think all of us should have the freedom to do, is we get a job or a college acceptance offer, or our family grows or shrinks or wants to be closer together, or, as the case may be, further apart, or we decide we want to live in a specific new city, and then we look for housing in that place. Most of us do not limit our search to new housing, or even necessarily prefer it, and even those of us who do will usually settle for older housing if new homes aren't available. That's ultimately why refusing to build new homes just exacerbates the problem. It does not change the fact that people want to live in your city. The demand is there no matter what you do. What not building does is force them to compete for the older housing stock when they do arrive, driving up its price and squeezing out lower and middle income households. When we build more housing, it has the effect of pulling people out of older, more affordable units into newer and better stock, creating vacancies in those older units that help stabilize rents and prices. This is really the mechanism by which new housing improves affordability. When we don't build, that pull turns into a push. As demand grows, people with the most resources crowd out those with less, pushing them down into lower quality housing. Upper income households push middle income households into lower income neighborhoods, and the people already in those lower income neighborhoods are pushed into other cities and other states or onto the street. We see this empirically in both the US and abroad. It is described by a concept called migration chains or moving chains. And this is very new research just out in the past few years and has been like revolutionary for me for being able to explain this process. When new buildings open up, as I said, the majority of people moving into the new units already lived within the metro area where the building was located or is located. That means that they're leaving behind a unit somewhere nearby. And that unit is almost always more affordable than the one they're moving into. Excuse me. Because most of the moves that people make throughout their lives are upward into better, nicer homes, nicer neighborhoods. The same applies to whoever moves into that newly vacated unit. They're usually leaving behind something more affordable too. To just put some illustrative numbers to this, and they probably do not reflect the cost here, imagine a new market rate building opens up and the units rent for $2,000 per month. It's a lot. Household A moves into that unit, and the unit they leave behind rents for $1,600. After the landlord touches up the unit and puts it back on the market, household B moves into and leaves into it and then leaves behind a unit renting for $1,300 a month, let's say. That's the second link in the moving chain. Jump ahead to the fifth move, and this research, multiple studies, shows that about half of the people moving into units made vacant because of this migration chain earn below the city's median income, and almost a third have incomes below the fifth, in the bottom fifth of the distribution. That's what this chart on the right shows. When all is said and done, 100 market rate units create vacancies in somewhere between 30 to 50 units of this much lower cost housing, this older housing, which not only directly benefits the people moving into those units, but it also just generally creates slack in the market that gives landlords less leeway to increase rents. Really, this dynamic applies to owner-occupied housing as well. It rebalances that market power between tenants and landlords and between home buyers and home sellers, and it does so without needing to use any public funds. This isn't to say that market rate buildings are a substitute for subsidies, either for affordable housing development or rent assistance, but what it shows is that the two approaches are complementary. They're not in tension with one another. Market rate homes stabilize rents and prices and ensure that we have a continuously improving housing stock. And by stabilizing prices, they also mean that the subsidies we spend, however much we decide to make available, whether it's a lot or a little, go further. I think analogies are helpful in many cases, so I want to look at another market, which is the one for used cars. As I'm sure many of you remember, in the 2 years following the outbreak of COVID-19, the price of used cars shot up dramatically, 50%, from an average of about $20,000 in January 2020 to over $30,000 by 2022. That did not happen because all of those used cars got nicer all of a sudden, miraculously. They just got more expensive because they became scarcer. First, new car production declined. Those new cars saw their prices rise as a result, and the impacts very quickly cascaded down to the used car market. Many people who would have bought a new car in 2020 or 2021 couldn't get one, so their used car didn't end up back on the market, and this newly created scarcity drove up prices across the whole market. Probably starting to sound familiar? Bottom line, the price of used cars is linked to the price and availability of new cars, and the price of used housing is linked to the price and availability of new housing. What distinguishes the car market from the housing market is that we chose to do this to our housing market in cities and towns and counties and states across the nation, and we've been enforcing this artificial scarcity for much, much longer. For cars, it was maybe 2 or 3 years. For housing, it's been about 40. Aside from being a thing that local governments have the most control over, another reason that I focus on supply is that building homes is not just a burden that we have to bear. We focus so much on the burdens that come with growth, and they are real, and they are not always fairly or equally distributed. But the growth is also how we ended up with all of the things and all of the places that we value today. It is an opportunity to build a better future for ourselves and for others. What I hope you will all appreciate is that when the town and the region that you live in is in demand, you have options. You can harness that demand and you can turn it into something positive if you plan for it. Your kids want to stay here when they grow up. Others want to come here to work and live. People believe in your community and they want to invest their time and their money here, and that means new shops and hospitals and infrastructure, new and better services, and new people, new friends and neighbors and employees. That is incredible, and it is a blessing and not a curse. There are thousands of cities and towns across America, I was just in the Rust Belt yesterday, that would give anything to have the problems that come with desirability and growth. So on that note, I have come to think that cities and towns really just have 3 potential possible futures. Over the medium and long term, cities are either shrinking or they're growing in one of 2 ways. So again, if you're in demand, then growth in some form is inevitable, but the form it takes depends on how you respond. One possibility is that you channel that demand into a growing housing stock. The other is into higher housing prices and rents. You can build and keep housing abundant and affordable, or you can not build and instead force people into a cruel game of musical chairs where those with the fewest resources are left with nowhere to sit when the music stops. Down that path lies worsening affordability, declining numbers of children and young families, overcrowding, supercommuting, and homelessness. The third option is only for places where people don't really want to be, places that are already stagnating or in decline. I don't think anyone here wants to become affordable by making Hendersonville or Henderson County a worse place to live. And I don't think you want to follow Los Angeles down path number 2. So it really has to be that first option. Here's another way of putting this. You can have a city that is appealing, affordable, or unchanging, but you can only pick 2. If it's appealing and unchanging, it is not going to be affordable. This describes places that draw a lot of people but build very little housing, including big cities like Los Angeles, but also smaller ones like Berkeley and Boulder, Colorado. If your city or town is unchanging and affordable, it's a pretty sure sign it is lacking appeal. Again, this is the story of many Rust Belt cities over the past several decades after manufacturing jobs left. And if it's appealing and affordable, as many cities, including Hendersonville here, are, then, or relatively affordable, then change is coming. People are coming whether you plan for it or not, and in a free country, that is their right. You can focus on the negatives and let that paralyze you, or you can roll up your sleeves and really make the most of it. As I wrap up here, I wanted to just quickly discuss a couple things at the cutting edge of housing research and of housing reform that I'm personally excited about, and I think have lessons for every jurisdiction in America, including Hendersonville. The first is missing middle housing, which is surely a term that's familiar to many folks here. This is the phrase coined by Daniel Paralek, who runs an architecture firm, design firm called Opticos Design. His book, Missing Middle Housing, is published by the same publisher as The Affordable City. Missing middle refers to the wide range of housing types that are denser than detached single-family homes, but smaller than 5 or more story multifamily buildings. That's the middle part. It's missing because we have built very little of it for the past 50 years or so. Development has really been dominated by the 2 ends of the spectrum, and especially the single-family detached house end. That's important because missing middle housing has a lot of benefits compared to both larger and smaller buildings, especially with respect to affordability. Like detached single-family houses, it can be built with wood, which is the least expensive way to build housing in the US. It's how single-family homes are built. It also usually doesn't require costly infrastructure, like elevators, and parking can be built at the ground level or only partially underground, saving tens of thousands of dollars per space compared to fully above or fully below ground parking. So it has construction costs like single-family homes, but it has per unit land costs like multifamily, because it is multifamily in most cases. In that sense, it is the best of both worlds, which is why missing middle housing tends to be more affordable than housing at either end of that spectrum, and people with lower incomes, not low incomes, but lower compared to single-family homes and the largest apartment buildings can actually afford. This also means that it's easier for local developers and contractors to get into this market. So we're not as reliant on national and international home builders to provide all of the housing that we need. And because the buildings are usually no more than 3 or 4 stories, they typically face at least a little bit less resistance than larger projects, though I will not pretend that housing reform is ever easy or uncontroversial. The second topic is one that I think I can take some credit for popularizing, which is broad upzoning, mass upzoning. We're still workshopping the name. This entails changing zoning to allow more housing on parcels across a city, not necessarily a whole city, but across a wide swath of it all at once, rather than doing targeted upzones, one neighborhood or one corridor or one parcel at a time, as we mostly do in most jurisdictions. When you upzone at that more local scale, you're doing a few things. One is you're very likely producing a windfall increase in the value of the upzoned parcels because you've created a relatively small number of locations where there will be intense interest in redevelopment and the price will inevitably be bid up. You're also concentrating redevelopment in just a few neighborhoods at a time, which also concentrates any real or perceived negative consequences from construction. The appeal of broad upzoning is that if every property or many properties now allow more homes, then no one's is especially more valuable. It's essentially this idea that if everyone is special, then no one is. Because no one's property is special, land prices should not climb nearly as much in response to that zoning change, and those savings can be passed along to tenants and to home buyers instead. And because more diverse housing types can be built in many new places, no neighborhood needs to bear a very disproportionate share of the burdens that come with that growth. It becomes a shared endeavor where every neighborhood contributes to solving the housing crisis. This combination of policies is brought up zoning to allow missing middle housing, was first tested, as far as I'm aware, in Auckland, New Zealand, back in 2016. But after seeing some very positive results where many new homes were built and Auckland's inflation-adjusted rents stayed flat 7 years after implementing their policy, while rents nationwide went up more than 15%, US cities have begun adopting a similar approach. The three most prominent that I'm aware of are Spokane, Washington, Burlington, Vermont, and Sacramento, California, all of which enacted these reforms within the past 6 months, and I believe all were passed unanimously by their city councils. I'm still investigating how they managed that. I do not really understand it. So if I come back sometime soon, maybe I'll be able to report back. But just so you know what this map is, that's Spokane, Washington, and the darker gray is the city. The very dark, which doesn't appear to be dark blue here, but that's what it actually is, that's the area they upzoned. It's 2/3 of the city, every single residential zone in the city. Speaking of how good ideas turn into policy, this year, Montana passed a housing, or rather last year, passed a housing package, a package of housing bills that a lot of people are referring to as the Montana miracle. We've seen similar reforms in other Western states, especially Washington, Oregon, California, but I feel like Montana is an important case because it has such different politics than those other states. I don't want to dig into specific reforms much here, but I do want to highlight Senate Bill 382, which is a law that gives cities a list of 15 reforms they can make, and it requires them to make at least 5. So the list includes things like allowing duplexes or accessory dwelling units anywhere single-family homes are permitted, eliminating or reducing parking requirements, or the same for impact fees, or reducing minimum lot sizes that you can build homes on, things of that nature. One thing I really appreciate about this approach, and I think is adaptable to different kinds of communities, is it requires everyone to contribute to increasing the availability and affordability of housing, but it does leave cities quite a bit of flexibility on how they do it. So in a Republican state where officials are wary of mandates, they found a way to require action in an individualized, freedom-loving kind of way. A researcher colleague of mine in DC was involved in these reforms and wrote a summary of how it all came together, and I found it was almost exactly the process I'd seen in some other cities that have done big things like Seattle. And so somehow, despite the very significant differences between Seattle and Montana, they achieved big things through a similar process. So as she tells it, the success boiled down to, first, starting with a big tent with a bunch of different perspectives represented on the committee that developed the recommendations. Second was mandating a quick process so it didn't drag on forever and let people get mired in the weeds. Third, the process openly invited and incorporated dissent for each proposal in the final report. And fourth, this was not mentioned by Emily, but it's really just my own insight, was a healthy fear of where things were headed if they didn't act. In Montana, this package of reforms was explicitly sold on the message of ending California-style zoning and not going down the same road as California. And I said it then, I will say it again, they absolutely have my blessing on that. California is a great foil to use, and if you ever want to tell your neighbors that zoning reform will keep you from becoming California, again, you have my blessing, please do. It's pretty effective. To be clear, at this point, you would not be alone in doing any reforms like this. Cities ranging from Gainesville to Minneapolis have eliminated single-family zoning entirely. Tucson, Louisville, Anchorage, Fayetteville, I do not know how to pronounce these, I apologize, are all among dozens of cities that now allow accessory dwelling units citywide in addition to many states. Charlotte and Raleigh did something similar, making it easier to build missing middle housing in their cities. Pasco, Washington is a smaller eastern Washington city that I've been continually impressed by. And of course, there are the recent examples of Spokane and Burlington and Sacramento. There are a lot of places to point to, but it is still early days. Cities and states are really just getting started, and these successes almost always start at the local level and with community conversations like these. The last thing I want to say is just reiterating something I've already said. I just want to encourage you to tackle these housing problems that you face with a clear sense of costs and benefits, for sure, but also with optimism and positivity. You should pat yourselves on the back. People love you. You built a wonderful community, and others want to share in it. I don't believe this community is so fragile that it will be ruined by more people, and you shouldn't either. Take it as a challenge and to share your city's opportunities and your friendship and your care with as many people as possible. So thank you again for the invitation, and I'm looking forward to the panel and to meeting more of you in the next day while I'm in town. Thank you. You go next. I never turned it off.
Oh, look at you go. Well, thank you, Shane, very much. It turns out we do have 15 minutes more for you after the break if you think of anything you want to add. Since we rushed
You don't
a
need to
little
hear about
Okay.
Eisenhower.
Thank you again to Shane for coming to speak with us. I think he gave us a lot of really good information, a lot of things to think about, some things that maybe we've already thought about before, things that put it in a new perspective. We're now going to take a short break, and then we'll come back to expand on the discussion with local panelists. There are restrooms that are accessible through the side doors on either side of the auditorium, and so we're going to see everybody back in 10 minutes. Okay, thankfully, you don't have to keep hearing from me. I am very excited to introduce our mayor, Barbara Volk. She is going to be the one that is going to be moderating our panel.
Thank you, Lindsay. I would like to welcome everyone here this evening. We're so glad we had a good turnout because this is an important issue for our whole community. We have some panelists, and I'll be asking them questions. We had solicited questions, so the questions that I'll be presenting came from the community. So I'd like to introduce the panel, although first, Shane, did any questions that came up during the break, anyone talk to you that you'd like to comment on? Oh, okay.
I've looked at them in advance, yeah.
All right. Okay, so I would like to introduce the rest of the panelists then. First is Lew Holloway. He is the Community Development Director for the City of Hendersonville. He oversees the planning, code enforcement, and downtown development for the city. He was trained as a landscape architect with a background in urban design. And Lew has worked in both the public and private sectors, including with the North Carolina Main Street Center. Next is Sarah Grymes. She's Vice President of Housing with the Dogwood Health Trust. As an experienced housing development expert with strong financial background, she joined Dogwood's community investment team in early January 2021 after previously serving as the executive director of the Housing Assistance Corporation in Hendersonville. Sarah Odio joined the Development Finance Initiative in 2016 as a graduate fellow while pursuing a master's degree in city and regional planning at UNC Chapel Hill. Now, as an assistant director, Odio specializes in affordable housing and has helped urban and rural communities across North Carolina understand their housing needs and attract private investment to mixed use and mixed income developments. She also oversees projects that range from commercial adaptive reuse to neighborhood revitalization. Thank you for being with us. and Christopher Todd. Chris is the Business and Community Development Director for Henderson County. In this role, he oversees all land use regulatory departments for the county. Previously, Mr. Todd was the town manager of the town of Laurel Park and the town of Sawmills. Now, as I mentioned, the questions were solicited from the community. Some of them I will have kind of been combined because they ran with similar themes. So I'd like to start out with the City of Hendersonville's Lew Holloway. What is considered affordable housing? Our family makes under $40,000 a year with 3 kids, and we cannot qualify for a bare bones apartment because of income restrictions. We pay well over 1/3 of our income to a private owner who is still renting to us well under current market value so that we have a safe place to live.
So obviously the fundamental question, right? And I'm going to try to answer it. There's a lot of different knowledge in this room, and some of the folks in this room are going to know the answer to this question much better than I am. But I do want to answer it in a way that I think will provide some context. And there's really 2 parts to that answer. There's a little a affordable and there's a capital A affordable. And in terms of the little a affordable, that's really the rule of thumb, the conventional wisdom for how much a household should spend of their income on shelter. So the inputs for household are household income and cost of the shelter. And generally, this amount, the 30% of your gross income is considered to include, electrical and gas, things like that. So the popular standard for budgeting is not to spend more than 30% of your gross income before taxes, and families which spend more than 30% of their income on housing are considered cost burden, while families expending more than 50% are considered severely cost burden. In Henderson County specifically, 1 in 4 households currently are cost burden, i.e. they're spending more than 30% of their income, and that includes both renters and owners, and represents a total of 12,233 households. So if you are spending 30% or less, you're considered to be spending an affordable amount of your income on shelter, and really that rule of thumb, conventional wisdom piece is housing that fits your budget, that fits your annual budget. The second part, the capital A affordable housing, is really related to the federal standards, and Shane touched on some of these things. This is the part that there are some providers, there's some nonprofits in the room that really have a great deal of knowledge on this. But I will try to do what I can in the allotted 2 minutes on what affordable housing is at the federal level. Again, it's based around income and cost of shelter, but in this case, the federal government sets the income with an area median income. So an area median income is established for regions. In this case, in Henderson County, our 2024 area median income is $86,100. So, half the population is making more, half is making less. When you hear about and for families, for the capital A affordable housing, folks that are making 80% or less of that area median income are considered eligible for that affordable housing. So when you hear a project is developed as affordable housing, it's most often supporting housing for families with income levels below 80%. And that does involve some sort of federal assistance. Some additional numbers for a 4-person family in Henderson County, the federal guidelines establish the following limits. So there are a number of different levels that the federal government establishes: extremely low income, and very low income, and those are at 30% of AMI, 50%, and 80%. So just for a family of 4, that equates to an income of $31,000, $46,000, $74,000. So in broad terms, assistance for these families is designed to prevent the expenditure of more than 30% of their incomes on units, with assistance covering the gap between that number and the other federal number, which is fair market rent. The federal government determines what a fair market rent is. So you have an area median income, what the area generates, what people in the area earn, and you have a fair market rent determined by the federal government, which is based on what rents in the area are, in theory. So again, affordable housing means, one, little a, housing that doesn't take more than 30% of your budget, and capital A is for families that are earning 80% of the local area median income or less and need assistance to afford that housing and to do so at that 30% level. Hopefully that is a reasonably good answer. The thing that I would definitely point out is that we have a really great group of nonprofits in the resource room, and I would encourage you to talk with them afterwards because there's a lot of great information on that front.
Okay, thank you, Lew. Our next question centers on local growth, so we'd like to hear from both Chris Todd and Lew on this one. We often hear from members of the community to take up the drawbridge. What is the reality of growth in Hendersonville and Henderson County? How much growth has Hendersonville and Henderson County experienced? And Shane did cover some of this.
Thank you, Mayor. One, I'm going to apologize because I love a soapbox, and those that know me know I can be long-winded, so if I get a little too long, Lew can come over here and tell me. They're already cutting. Well, this is a really fascinating question because the data is widespread. I can give you some percentages, and I'm going to in a moment, but the thing about math is it can tell you whatever it is you want it to tell. That's the story of math. My mother was an accountant. She always told me that. But if we go back in time, and I think that's important, and we look at this history, I want to start there because the growth and when the growth happened, because we have had growth, and I'm going to say that in a numeric way in a moment, has happened at different stages in history, and understanding when and how that's happened is important. If we go back to 1970, and why, in part, I'm picking that date, that was the completion, roughly, of I-26. You had a massive corridor that came through the county and Buncombe County at that time that didn't exist. And while I've not studied this, I do imagine it had, at least initially, some impact, right? Because how you accessed and who came through, that was a reality that changed this community forever. Between 1970 and the 2020 census, Henderson County as a whole saw 169% population increase, which is a lot. To put that in some context, in that same time frame, the United States grew at about 63%, so almost 3 times. The state of North Carolina grew at 105%, so a great deal more. Our neighbors to the north, Buncombe County, grew at 82%. All of those places quite significantly less than Henderson County. Their population numbers, like in Buncombe County, may have actually been more people. But if we look at those percent increases over time, ours was rather staggering. If you look at the unincorporated areas of Henderson County during that time, the percent goes down a little bit, okay? But it's only 133%. So out of all the numbers I just mentioned outside of this area, it's still high. In comparison, and this is where it's a difference, but one that's nominal at best, the city of Hendersonville from 1970 as just a municipality grew 135%. I'm going to call that even. So, but in that time frame, and I do think this is important as we look at the growth, the municipality of Hendersonville and the county grew at roughly a proportional rate over time. If we look at other places within the county, and I looked at all the other municipalities, the one that actually grew the most was Laurel Park at 287% in that time frame. Now their population today is about 2,200 people, so it's not the biggest dent, but I thought that was an interesting fact. If we start to look at more modern times, as we're doing this and we really break it out, if we look between the years of about 2000 and 2020, the county as a whole grew about 30%. Now that's starting to get more on par with other places, okay? The state at the time grew at a rate of about 30%. The United States grew at a rate of about 18%. So North Carolina was doing well in that time. Buncombe County at that time was also about 18%, right? So they matched that. All of these numbers are important because what we really saw in some ways in a massive growth boom was up to kind of pre-2000 and 2008. 2008 is a massive marker in our population and in the growth percentages. We're still growing. That's true. But 2008 really differentiates that growth, because if we look at the time frame of about 2010 to 2020, and I know that there's 2 decades versus 1, you're looking at a rate of the whole county at about 7%, which is less than the state average at 9, on par with the national average at 7, right? As we've gotten into closer history, our percents are leveling. We're growing, and we're still about on par with each other as the county and the municipalities. And it's hard to quantify the municipal impact of growth at times versus the county, because when we started in 1970, there were 3 municipalities in the county, and today there are 6, right? And so understanding what that true impact between those are is a little hard to quantify, because as Shane alluded to, land use and all these other things has impacted that growth over time, right? That's the thing that I think I want to leave with the statistics. We're growing, and we are growing quickly, but that 2008, 2010 time frame has really been when we've started to track more on a national and state average. And before that, we had some significant growth. But Lew, do you want to add anything?
Really just adding the that 2008 point. Shane alluded to this at the national level, but we saw it locally too in terms of construction dropping. So in 2007 we peaked with 1,300 units constructed in Henderson County. 2010 we bottomed out at 200 units a year, and we've been creeping back up. 22, saw permits creep back up over 1,000 units for the first time in more than a decade. So population continues to grow, but construction took a major hit, which is really one of the points that Shane had made. We also do have an increasing prevalence of vacation rentals. Over 3,500 of the county's 5,600 housing units are vacant and associated with short-term rental stays. So that's 6.2% of our unit count is associated with short-term rentals. So those kinds of impacts, limit the availability of stock and housing.
Okay, thank you. Shane, we'd like to circle back with you on this question. What role does zoning play in the creation of affordable housing, and can you also speak on inclusionary zoning?
Sure. Glad I get to keep my microphone here. So zoning is really foundational to affordability. Nationally, and this was kind of a decision made by almost every municipality across the country, somewhat independently, although sort of pressured by the federal government 100 years ago. Everyone adopted a zoning code, and over a period of decades, it kind of started out as very general, like you can have residential here and maybe commercial and residential there and only industrial here. And they've just gotten more and more complicated over time. And by the 50s, 60s, maybe a little earlier, the single-family housing only zone was the dominant zone, especially for residential zones, where basically cities said, on most of the residentially zoned parcels, the parcels where you can build housing of some kind, you can only build a detached single-family house and nothing else. And both because these homes tend to be relatively large, but also because in order to buy one of those homes, you also have to buy a lot of land, whether you really need it or not. The cost of single-family homes is higher on average by far than the alternatives. And so it's sort of walled off opportunities for more affordable housing across the country. And a lot of people just genuinely cannot afford a single-family home just about anywhere, but especially in some communities. So zoning reform has been a real priority for housing advocates and policymakers and scholars and others, not because it's the only thing that matters, but what we allow to be built does determine to a great extent the price of that housing. If we only allow the most expensive housing to be built, then housing is going to be very expensive. If we allow somewhat less expensive, and I'm not saying lower quality housing, just smaller units, sharing the cost of land, sharing walls, these kinds of things, we can bring down that cost and give people options. And I think it's really important to say that even in places that have gotten rid of single-family zoning, they basically, every parcel in the city allows at least a home and an ADU or a threeplex or what have you. Even in those places, most homes are still single-family homes. Single-family homes still get built. They just don't prohibit everything else. And so that's kind of the direction we've been moving nationally. Still very early days. I mean, 5 years ago, if you had told me that California would no longer have single-family zoning and would not require parking near transit, within a half a mile of transit in new developments, I'm not sure I would have believed you. It was considered a third rail, both of those things. But we've kind of, frankly, through conversations like these, people have recognized the costs of these kinds of policies. And not everywhere needs to get rid of single-family zoning entirely. Not everywhere certainly needs to look like Los Angeles, but allowing more options so that people can choose the housing that better suits their needs. If I'm a single person coming out of college or retiring, I don't probably need a 4-bedroom single-family home, and yet in many communities that is the only option available to you. And so that's kind of some of the story of zoning. I could probably talk about zoning for 4 hours. Inclusionary zoning is a policy, and I'll be quick on this one. It's a policy where basically it's responding to exclusionary zoning, which is the zoning we've had in this country for many decades that prohibits most kinds of housing and, by proxy, prohibits certain kinds of people. Inclusionary zoning is one means of trying to reverse that a little bit, and specifically it requires, if you're going to build usually a multifamily building, you have to provide some share of them, usually 10 or 20% or so of the units at below market prices, affordable to low-income households, moderate-income households, very low. It varies from place to place. And I've written something about this just recently that was published with the Lewis Center where I work and the Turner Center at Berkeley. I think I will just say if you're really interested, you can read about it. It has costs and benefits. I will leave it at that. I think that's enough to say. I don't want to take too much time, but it's a policy.
Okay, thank you. We'll move to DFI's Sarah Odio for this question. As a LIHTC developer, we are running out of viable land or land that we can afford to develop in Henderson County. What are options that can be pursued? And if you will, Sarah, please say what LIHTC means.
I could teach an entire day's course on that, but I'll start by saying that it is a federal program. It is the largest federal program that funds private development of multifamily rental units in the U.S. It is really the engine for multifamily rental development across the country. What is important, I think, to answer this question, which is pretty huge, is that there are two types of tax credits. There is a 9%, which is incredibly competitive and is really all about where your sites are located. How close are you to the grocery store, pharmacy, what other amenities are in proximity? In less dense areas, it becomes incredibly challenging to find sites that work in proximity. So the 4% tax credit, as the numbers indicate, is a little bit less subsidy, right, or a lot less subsidy, but allows for more flexibility in where your sites are located. Now I'm going to go back to this viable sites question, because, that is big, because viability has so many definitions when it comes to development and affordable development. We can speak to the zoning question off the bat. Is a site viable if you can't actually build multifamily housing and use the tax credit on it? There's also neighborhood context. You've all been there. You've probably been at that meeting where people are very supportive of housing, they just don't want it there. There are
I think we have a name for that.
Yeah.
We do have a name for that, yes. It's also things like water and sewer, but the big one, and I think that this is really what it comes down to, is the big ones are political will and money, which we call resources, to be a little bit softer on it. But to use the 4% tax credit, which gives you that flexibility, you do need a greater level of soft money, which just means you're probably not going to get all of that money back. So you're looking for local government partners or foundations or other funders that are willing to make that project happen without expectation of seeing most of that money come back. And this can be, I think people, you're starting housing trust funds, you're thinking about, hey, how do we fund this stuff? And people are starting with $500,000. The gaps on these projects can be easily deep into the millions. And so going back to the viable question, it comes to, do you have the funds to be able to use these tax credits and go a little bit farther out? And also, do you have the political will to rezone the properties that would be appropriate? Think about water and sewer extensions, take on the neighborhood context, and also build relationships. I bet if we looked around this room, there are people in this room that can probably think of a property, whether it's owned by a nonprofit partner, a church, a private partner, that would maybe consider putting that into the pot for housing development. So I could go on forever, so I'm going to put a pin in it there, but really viable sites it's going to be about that political will. It will be about those funding sources.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Back to Shane for the following. We have a luxury 120-unit condominium being constructed downtown. You may have seen it as you drove in. How will this benefit local residents in need of affordable housing? And will it cause an increase in property tax for people who live in that area? Does this type of development indirectly benefit middle-income households?
I was told about this project on the way here. I'm glad I was told about it because I saw that question and I assumed it was kind of like the way that people say that every new building is a luxury building, but my understanding is this is like really luxury, like millions of dollars. I think, the short answer is there's probably not much affordability benefit. I talked about the migration chains. You tell me who is living here that can afford to move into those homes. But, that doesn't mean automatically that it's bad. I think the other question about how this will affect taxes, I would imagine, if anything, it's going to be a huge boon for the city. It's going to bring in a lot of property taxes to the city and county, and presumably the people living there are not going to be using a whole lot of services. So, I think housing can serve different purposes, and maybe this housing is really just about we're getting a bunch of property taxes, and that's nice. But I can't see how it would affect affordability, unless you're going to take those property taxes and, build some affordable housing maybe.
Okay, thank you. Sarah Grymes with Dogwood Health Trust. This next question's for you. What role can a private or nonprofit developer play in the creation of affordable housing? And do you have any examples where this has been successful in our region?
Yes, on both. I will just say the role of the private developer and the nonprofit developer, we couldn't do anything without those key partners in any kind of housing development at all. The expertise that they bring to the table, the relationships that they have with different funders, and the developers really typically, especially when they're working with key groups and community, when groups are coming together like the city and the county and nonprofits and the private sector, the public sector, to really change something that we're talking about here today, you have to have someone with that experience that can make it happen for you. And so, and the relationships and the funding that they can bring to the table are just key. Henderson County is so lucky that you have so many nonprofits working in this. Housing Assistance Corporation, where I was so lucky to be able to be with that organization for many years as a board member and then running it as the executive director and working with them today, the experience that they can bring and have for so many years. You've got that organization as well as so many others that are poised and ready to help tackle this issue. But it can't be just one nonprofit development organization. It's the private sector who can really help with single-family development and the preservation and new creation of new housing stock in all the different ways that we're talking about today. We've talked about 2007 and 2008, and then I will double down with 2012. Most of the developers, single-family developers in our area were forced out of business. And that's something we're still recovering from. So Henderson County has a severe lack of workforce on top of higher rates and higher costs than pre-COVID. So really it is everybody coming together to solve this issue. So to the examples that are here today, you have a wonderful example right here in Henderson County happening now, where the city and the county have come together with Housing Assistance Corporation and then another developer using some federal funds to get 60 units of rental housing and 20 single-family units. So that is a big dent. That's a big deal. And I think in the county, this is the biggest partnership that's happened to date. So kudos for you all for making that happen. Examples, Dogwood, we work in the 18 counties of Western North Carolina. So another example that I'll bring up is our far west county, Cherokee County. We started with them similar like we're starting here with Hendersonville, where just finding out what the needs are and talking to stakeholders in the community who are interested in this and really put together an action plan of something that's viable. So we started there. It's a county with very little water and sewer infrastructure. They don't have much land that's ever going to hit a low-income housing tax credit program. But they did have a lot of will. And they had a community college that was willing to step up to the plate and start a carpentry program, really recruit students of all ages into the program. And then 2 municipalities donated land where those homes will be built. So us as a private funder saw so much momentum from municipal government, from the county government, from nonprofits, community college, economic development, the Chamber of Commerce, all coming together. So those students will be building out 34 homes over the next 6 years, but they will get hands-on training to go into the workforce. More workforce lowers costs. There's not as much competition right now. I think any contractor out there can build a high-end home all day long. There's not much incentive to do it on the lower level, but that can change when public and private partnerships come together.
Okay, thank you. The next question, Lew kind of alluded to with one of the statistics he had, and that is, how do short-term rentals impact the affordability of communities, including ours? Shane, do you have any experience with these?
Yeah, there have been studies on this, and I think the short answer is that, you know, more short-term rentals mean higher prices to a meaningful extent. Where those are located obviously matters. If they're homes that are built for the purpose of being short-term rentals in locations where there aren't really jobs and people weren't going to live anyway, that like, you know, probably not much of an impact, but I assume that's not generally what we're talking about. In the book, I'm pretty strongly supportive of regulations on short-term rentals where, you know, maybe you do have some places where you allow them kind of full-time and essentially have people running them as businesses. But I do think in cities, in higher demand areas, I think it's appropriate to say, you know, you cannot rent these things out a full unit without you yourself living there and being there when someone's there for more than, you know, a few months. I think if people want to go on vacation and rent out their home, go for it. That's perfectly fine. But as a full-time business, I think it really does have negative consequences. And as I was saying, like, building housing takes a long time, and it can be taken off the market immediately through a short-term rental. And so putting some space between those things, I think, makes sense. And it's all about how you design the policy, as I've said before. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. This next one, we'd like to hear from both Shane and Sarah Odio. What are some examples of places that have put in anti-displacement, anti-gentrification measures? What are some strategies, and are they typically successful?
Okay, well, I'm going to start with an example of a community-led. So when you say place, it might be local government, you know, but I'm thinking of it from the point of view of partnerships that included local government. In Carborough, Chapel Hill, there is the Jackson Center, the North Side neighborhood. And to me, that is the greatest example of a community being able to put in place on its own these anti-displacement, or I'll say anti-gentrification approaches, or what's the right word? The mechanisms. What they really did was they came together to identify what their goals were. What did anti-displacement mean for their community, and what tools were available to do that? And so they did everything from use historic district designation to be able to limit what could be done. They used different land trust models. So they have a land trust model in place for some properties where it was appropriate. If you don't know what a land trust is, it is putting the land itself into a trust and separating that from the actual home. So a homeowner comes in, they buy the house itself, and they get a lease on the actual land. And that land is held by a trust in perpetuity. And so when that homeowner decides to sell, they realize, you know, some appreciation in the value of that home, but the next homeowner will also have to be a low-income homeowner and sign a new lease with that trust. And so they created this community-held trust that allowed them to control what happens with their property going forward. They also used models, things like land banking, which is different, which was identifying properties that were in distress, but that did not have an immediate plan yet, buying them up. I'm forgetting some of the stuff they used, but the point is that it was not one solution. The reality of it is it was very committed community members and a whole lot of tools. UNC ended up coming to the table. The local government came to the table with resources. They had various partners, self-help, and all of them had to come together to what has now been really a stabilized neighborhood.
I'm good.
Oh, yes.
Well, I like that you talked about some subsidized programs, because I can talk about some policy and like selection things. So, you know, what I write in my book, and I realize this is not feasible in North Carolina right now, but I still do want to say it because I think it's important, is a combination of rent stabilization and just cause eviction protections, which prohibit landlords from evicting people for no reason, basically. If they violate their lease, you can evict them. If you need to do certain things like have a family member move in or tear it down to build something new, you can evict people, but not for other, you know, no reason or other reasons. And, you know, what we see is that in Los Angeles, for example, which has rent stabilization, for one, it's, as I said, a very clear example of how rent stabilization and all these kinds of protections are not enough by themselves if you have consistent and persistent scarcity of housing. But even so, in Los Angeles, you compare people living in rent-stabilized housing to people living in the same kinds of housing, the same age of housing in neighboring jurisdictions, And the share of the population that has been in their units for more than 10 years is considerably higher. And what that tells me is that a lot of people who would have been displaced, would have had to move out because their rents would have been increased too much, were able to stay. And I think there is real value in that, even though there are costs to rent stabilization. But again, as I say in my book, there are really ways to design that policy to have minimal negative impacts and not sort of duplicate the problems that we've seen with like New York's rent control program, with what was proposed in St. Paul, with what places like Mumbai have. So that's one thing. And as I know that rent stabilization at least is preempted by state law right now, but who knows, that may not always be the case. The other thing I wanted to say was, I know San Francisco's doing this. I imagine some other places are doing it. It requires working with the federal government because there's concerns about violating fair housing law, ironically, with this policy. But they've done this thing where with some affordable housing buildings, subsidized affordable housing buildings, they are giving preferential selection to people who have been displaced from the community in which that was built or who are at risk of displacement from that community. And I think that kind of policy has a lot of promise. You don't want it to be solely for the people in that community. I think there are real fairness issues with that. But I think some preference, especially for people who were actually displaced or who are have an eviction pending because their building's being torn down, I think allowing people or prioritizing those people rather than relying purely on a lottery, as things are usually done for subsidized buildings, has a lot of promise.
And I want to add to that, which is that, yes, you said all the things that I can't say as the School of Government, because North Carolina doesn't allow any of that. But there is on the piece in terms of preferential and bringing people back. When you have community ownership, they also have control over who gets to live in that home. So when it's not the local government that owns the land, or it's not somebody who is getting a federal subsidy, if it's locally funded, then they do have more flexibility in who the future homeowners are. So,
Okay. I have one last question I'd like to pose to the panelists here. What should be the first step this community should take to address affordable housing? Who wants to start? Lou, I'm going to put you on.
No, let me cheat.
This was not on their
I'm going to
cheat
cheat.
sheets.
You just took it. Yes.
So I'm going to do a mild cop-out, which is to say, I think that what we're doing with the affordable, as Shane noted, with the Affordable Housing Committee and with our comprehensive plan and the process that we've gone through to have these conversations, I was laughing a little bit to myself when I saw this crowd. Typically, I have to put a yellow rezoning sign out to get this kind of crowd in a room. And so it's exciting to see it for a policy discussion, and I think that we are very much, beginning a conversation that will help us identify things that are true to our community, that fit our community, that will help us, begin to address this challenge.
Sarah?
Well, I agree. This is, I think, the most important step. And it's so exciting to have so many people in the room, because I think change really happens when we all collaborate. And I just look forward to, today, the stakeholder meetings that come, the committees, putting into action, and then bringing the community together. Because I do think, I was born and raised here, so I'm a little partial, but so excited just to see so many people coming together for this to happen, because all these people in the room, and affordable housing can be contentious. It can be hard to talk about, but some of the best things come out when we're really honest and we start really understanding who we're trying to help and what we're trying to do, and we lift each other up to a great goal. So I'm so excited for this opportunity.
I will say that I think land is power. Land is where you have control over the future of your community. And so for me, and I'm biased because this is what, I do, but I think controlling the land that will allow you the opportunity to expand your housing options is the first major step that you can take. All these conversations are going to make it happen in the long run, but that's kind of that tangible, practical step. What do you control? What do your partners control? And what can you do with that to make a dent in the market?
Okay. Chris?
I'm also going to cop out. No. Lew said something a minute ago that's true for both the city and the county. There's a step that's been undertaken, and that's the comprehensive land use plans that we have for our respective jurisdictions. Shane alluded in his talk earlier that one of the things that we need sometimes is actually to make permitting processes easier, not harder, because permitting processes can get in the way of housing development. Now, the challenge with doing that, and the challenge that sometimes we face as staff and our elected officials face, is the ability to write a plan and create a document that actually reflects, because it never will, 100% of the views of the people, so that there's not always conflict, right? We do our best to do it well, and I will speak for the county. I think we did a really good job, and the city's in the process of it right now and putting a strong effort towards having that document be well done. Figuring that out is going to be a big part of this, because it links to the policy, it links to the stability, that cooperation that Sarah said earlier, that the city and the county have come together on a project. But the city and the county are made up of you all. If we can come together, but some of it's going to be, and it started here tonight, not to be cheesy again, but it's going to take you all coming together to figure out what your priorities are, and to stand behind them for a long time, even when it's hard, right? In order to actually make significant change. And I challenge you all to do that, as I challenge myself, who's both a resident, and I'm not from here, I'm part of the problem. And so are my 2 children, my wife. But it is going to take all of us as a community acting broadly in order to get there, and that's the hardest part. I think if we can come together as a majority and as a community, we will be able to solve this problem.
Okay, thank you. There is one last question, which was pretty much directed to the city of Hendersonville, so I'm going to answer it. It says, is this community actually going to create viable, livable change in our community, or just one more thing to make people feel good? Hendersonville is not going to be able to solve the housing problems on our own. As our speakers have said, this is a national problem. As much as some people would like us to, we can't stop others from wanting to move to our attractive area. Not building more housing units won't keep people from coming. It will just increase the cost of what's already here. The City Council has been committed to providing housing in a variety of price ranges for years. We have long allowed duplexes by right in all zoning categories. We have approved and sent letters of support for many low-income housing tax credit projects, although not all have received those tax credits and thus have not been constructed. City staff will be revising our development and zoning codes after we adopt our Gen H comprehensive plan and hope to simplify regulations to allow more by right development through form-based codes. The members of the council look forward to continuing to work with our governmental, nonprofit, and development partners to provide housing at a variety of price points, making Hendersonville and Henderson County an even better place to live. So. To wrap things up, I will call on City Council Member Jennifer Hensley.
Okay. One of the things that Shane mentioned tonight, that I kind of rang really true to me, was he said, where will our children live? And I think that's something that I even forget about a lot, because I constantly hear, we don't want any more, no more people moving here. But again, like, what about the people who live here now? I'm a city councilwoman and a wife and a mom of 2 small kids. And we have these people who are here who are going to be growing up, graduating high school, entering the workforce, going to college, maybe not leaving Hendersonville or Henderson County, but staying here. And so how are we going to take care of our generations? And so again, you know, talking about the housing supply is a thing that we have to continue talking about. And I was fortunate enough, and I've seen a few people here who we kind of bonded together because we actually participated in the Duke Leadership Forum, and we are graduates of that program, and the cohort was specifically solving affordable housing in Western North Carolina. And while I don't know that we're going to solve the problem, like, I'm so proud of the people who are here in this room who have shown up tonight on a Thursday night, and you could be doing anything else that you wanted to do, but you're here, and showing that commitment to this community is really meaningful to me, and I know it's meaningful to the council and also the panelists that are up here. So I just really appreciate everybody being here and having an open mind to be here. Obviously, this is not a City of Hendersonville issue. It's an entire community, and we're taking steps. We've already taken steps and working together to try to address some of the issues, and I think we're just stronger together. Shane, thank you so much for coming. Like, this is really awesome that you're here, and I love the fact that you have all of these tools. Maybe you'll make us a toolkit, and then you can present it to us.
I think it's just called my book.
I like it.
We can work on more specific recommendations.
Maybe like a map.
Yes.
I like maps. No charts for Lew, please. Although you did have a really fabulous 3-round, what is that specific chart called? If you don't want
Venn
this.
diagram?
Yeah, Brian Polly, our assistant county, our city manager, he's also a big fan of those. So Sarah's, Odio, and Grymes, thank you so much for being here. Chris Todd, Lew Holloway, we appreciate all the work that you guys do for our community, and thanks for being a part of tonight. We really appreciate the Dogwood Health Trust and all of your generosity and providing us like a springboard for this strategic housing plan. This is epic for our area, and we're very, very grateful. Henderson County Public Schools and Hendersonville High School Leadership Class, thank you for being such wonderful hosts. Melissa Escobar and True Ridge for providing the interpretive services. We thank Bruce Drysdale, Immaculata, St. James Episcopal Church for all the logistical help and parking tonight. If I can, I would like to ask our Hendersonville City Council members who are here and anybody from the Strategic Housing Plan Steering Committee to stand up. You all have shown commitment to our community, and we thank you all for your sacrifice and just all the extra work that you do. Thank you very much for all your help. Lastly, I do want to thank everybody here again. You've submitted questions, and you're here, and you're participating. And I know that, and I'm speaking for myself, but I know everybody in this room, we really care about this community. And I want to see this community stay beautiful and clean and pretty and safe. And I want to be able to see our children afford to still live here someday. And so just thanks again for everybody. Before you leave, don't forget about the resource room that is directly behind the stage. We have an array of nonprofits and service providers who are here to have good conversations with you and provide you with resources. We have a sign-up list where you can stay updated on our strategic housing plan development process. And again, thanks everybody for being here, and have a wonderful night.